Warning, this video is not for beginners. If you haven't worked with a different web framework before, a lot of this won't make a lot of sense. If you're still learning JavaScript and learning what DOM elements are, things like that, come back to this video later in your web development journey. Okay, so you read the title of the video. What we're going to do here is go over Astro as fast as humanly possible. Astro is really great if you need to have a very basic blog type site and you want to do it fast and you want to make the load times extremely fast. It's beneficial for your SEO. It's also beneficial for user experience. So let's just jump right into it because we're short on time here. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm in VS Code and I'm just in a blank directory I called Astro fast. And what we're going to do is we're going to run npm create Astro at latest. And I'm going to add a period after it to just specify that I want it to build right in this directory. So we'll get that, and then we'll get this little helpful assistant in our terminal here. And so how would you like to start a new project? You may want to use a blog template. However, I'm trying to make sure that you understand everything we're doing step by step. So I'm going to start with empty. Do you plan on writing in Typescript? Yes. I'm going to use strict. And we are going to install our npm dependencies. I will initialize a new Git repository, and now we just need to wait for that to be done. So the first thing that we're going to go look at here is we'll look at our index.astro file. And here you can see a very basic page. I'm going to do npm run dev just to show you it. Then you'll just see this Astro in the h1 tag like we have shown here. You'll notice some other metadata, but that's not important right now. We'll come back to that. So what we first should talk about is how you create pages in Astro. So index.astro, this is going to be rendered on just the home page. For example, if I created a blog directory and then I went in and created index.astro in here, I'm, for example, going to just copy this over and I'll just add blog so that you can see the difference. If we go back to our browser and I type in blog, you'll now see Astro blog. So that's how we create a new page. In here though, if you say created a file called test.astro and I paste in the same content, I'll add test. This will be rendered on the URL /blog/test. So that's how you create pages. What we can do is I'm going to go into our pages directory right here, and I'm going to do 404.astro. This is how you create a 404 page. So here I'll go 404 and I'll go, oops, page doesn't exist. And now if we type in something that we don't have a page defined for, you'll get this 404 page. So that's the basics of how you create pages in Astro. I'm just going to delete this test one because I don't want that for the rest of what we're doing. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about layouts. So I'm going to create a new folder called layouts in our source directory. Everything goes in your source directory. And then in here, I'm just going to create something called layout.astro. And I'm going to just copy in the same content. And what we're going to do is we're going to go in here and we're going to add something called a slot. So slot, if you're used to working in React or Next.js or something, that's kind of similar to just specifying children. So we'll save that. And I'm going to now go to our index.astro page. I'm going to get rid of all this. And I'm going to use layout. My IDE is going to auto import it. And I'll move this up here. Save that. And then let's go back to our browser and go to the home page. So you will notice that it's exactly the same as it was. And just to show that this is working, I'll just add a little p tag here and put test. And you'll now see that above where we are rendering our content. So this slot is in our index page where we are just specifying children, and that's a good way of doing it. We can specify props for it later so that we can define a title and meta description, all that stuff, but that's just a little bit of an easier way of organizing your code. The next thing that we're going to do is let's talk about styling. So typically I'm a Tailwind guy. That's what I usually use, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but in case you aren't, let's go over how you do it. So in our index.astro page, we can go down here and we can just create a style tag underneath. It doesn't have to be in the actual DOM elements as shown here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do h1, and I'll do a color of blue. So now if we go back, we see that our text is blue. When you do this, your code is, or your style, I should say, is in the scope of just this page or component. So if you don't want it to be, what I imagine 99% of the time you're going to want it that way, you can do is global. And that will then make this be global site-wide. So every h1 tag you would have would be blue, for example. But it's where you're going to want to do that, and if you want to do that, you're probably going to want to have an external style sheet. So that's what we'll talk about next. So I'm going to go into our source directory, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call it styles. And in styles, I'm going to do, I'll call it just index.css. And in here, I'll say h1, targeting the same tag, and I'll do text align, and we'll make it center aligned. And then all you have to do is go back over to your page and import that into your into this page. So, and then I'll do styles/index.css, and then when we go back, you'll now see that it is center aligned in the browser. So that's pretty helpful. What if you want to work with SASS or CSS? You are going to want to go into I have another terminal open here in the same directory, and I'm just going to do npm I SASS, and now we have a package for that, and I'm going to go, I'll get rid of this file, and I'll do a new one called index.sass. And in here, I'm going to grab just some example SCSS, save that. So just showing that we can save a variable, and I'll go back to our index.pages. Okay, so in order to get the SASS file to work, all you have to do is import it here. So you'll see it imported at the top of my index page, so the base page of my site. And when I go back to here, you'll see that now we have this nice little light blue as is defined with this hex code. So that's how you get your SASS to work. And if you ever want to do it inline, one thing you need to keep in mind is you just need to add a lang attribute of SASS, and then in here you can write whatever you want in terms of your SASS code, and if you don't make it global, it will be just scoped to this page or component. So the next thing that we're going to do is now let's start talking about frameworks. So Astro uses something called Astro Islands in order to use whatever framework you really want. They have a ton of implementations: Vue, Svelte, React. I'm going to use React in this video because that's my preferred. But how it essentially works is all of your HTML is going to be generated server-side. However, then you can have these little islands that you fill in. They're called islands, and it's just a little piece of the page, effectively, that can either be rendered on the client, or you can generate the HTML and hydrate it on the client. It's all up to you. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to add 2 more NPM dependencies. I'm going to add the React package as well as Tailwind. So you can do it manually with NPM. However, Astro makes it super easy for you to set up by using an npx command. So if you see here, I'm using npx astro add react. And what this is going to do is this is going to ask me just some questions to set it up. So am I willing to install these packages? Yes, just pressing Y on my keyboard. And then am I willing to add it to my Astro config? And yes, I am. And then it's going to ask me some other compiler options. Don't worry about this too much. Just say yes. And now we have React installed, and we can use React within our page. So I'm now also going to add Tailwind. So it's the same thing. It's npx astro add Tailwind. And I'm going to add that. And I'm going to hit yes. And then I'm going to hit yes again, and yes. So now we have this config file, and you can just see that we have these integrations. So unlike something like Next.js, for example, you opt in to more complexity. Next.js comes shipped with basically everything you need and more. Astro, in order to keep your builds a lot thinner, you have to add in all the technologies that you want. So that's what we're doing right here, and it's the same if you want to use a backend API. If you want to set that up with your Astro project, you're going to have to use something serverless like Vercel and a plug from them in order to set that up. But if you ever go to their documentation, they make it super easy to set up, so don't worry about that too much. So now that we have Tailwind, I'll just give a quick example. In our index page, you will now notice if I go back to our browser, you will see that the font size changed on this text right here. And the reason that is because with Tailwind, it by default makes all the text the same size, and then you style it from there. So for example, I could give it this h1 text, h1 tag a class of text XL, and that will make our text bigger, and etc. So we have Tailwind all set up. So now that we know how to style things, let's talk about creating components using whatever your favorite framework is. So I'm going to create a new folder in my source directory. I'm going to call it components. And then in here, I'm going to create a TSX file, which just the typesafe version of JSX. So, and we're just going to create a basic counter, one of the most basic sort of components that you'll see in a lot of tutorials online. And I'm just going to use some of the key bindings I have inside of VS Code here to quickly generate this little component. And what we're going to do is I'm going to go in this div, and I'm going to create an h2 tag, and I'll say count. And then I'm going to go up here, and we're going to create a stateful variable using the useState hook in React. And I'll call it count, and then I'll create a setCount function so we can mutate that variable. And then I'm using useState, and we'll set it to 0. And what we'll do here is we're going to do count. And then below that, I'm going to create a button that we're going to use to click to increment that count. I'm going to use some Tailwind classes just to style it a little bit so it's easier for you to see. I'll do text XL, border, rounded, and then in here I'm just going to put a plus sign. And I'm now going to do an onClick function and pass that an anonymous function that will mutate the setCount variable. And what I'm going to do is just do count plus 1. You can make a counter for example's sake in whatever framework you prefer, but I prefer React. If you don't know React, it's not a big deal. Just create something that uses some JavaScript on the client. in order to, for this example. It all makes sense in a second why I'm doing this. So now we have this all set up. That looks good to me. We're rendering this. Perfect. Okay, so let's go back to our index page. And now all we have to do is we just have to import it. I'm using an auto import, and let's close that off. And now when we open our browser, you'll see we have this little count, and we have this button we can click. But if you notice I'm clicking it, it's not incrementing it. And you might be thinking, why is that? And the reason is because Astro ships no JavaScript by default. That's one of the beauties of Astro. You have to opt into using JavaScript. Right now, this whole page is just static HTML, even though I'm using React. So what we need to do in order to create this interactive island, this Astro island, like I was talking about before, we're going to use the client directive. And here, if you can see on the screen, you see we have some options. I'm going to use load. So what that means is that will ship the HTML as static, and then it will hydrate the JavaScript on the client. So I'll save that, and now you'll see that this counter will work beautifully. So now we have opted into JavaScript, and we are now using that. Client load means that as soon as possible, it's going to hydrate that component. But you could also use something like client visible. And what that'll do, in the case of this, you won't see a difference, but visible would mean that it would load it as soon as the component is visible on the page. So if you had it, say, below the fold, you might want to use something like that to speed up your initial load. So that's how you do that. You can also, if you want to make it client side entirely, you can use client only, and then you have to pass it what framework you're using. I'm using React, and now what this is doing is this is loading like a traditional React component. So this would ship just in a blank div, for example, and the JavaScript on the client would render all that HTML to the DOM. So, but we're gonna use load because there's no reason for us to want to have it completely client-side only. So that's how you can use components, and this is the same for every framework. You can create a Svelte component, and as long as you pass it this directive, you will be able to use JavaScript on the client that is hydrated. If you don't, what's really great though, say I just felt like I wanted to create some of my HTML as a React component, I can just not pass that directive, and now this is just completely static HTML. So if that works better for your workflow, you can do that too. You have that option available to you. Okay, so now let's talk about the blog. The blog uses something called collections in Astro. It allows you to essentially create a type for your schema, and you can create any variables you need, and then you create the blog's content in Markdown. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder in my source directory, and I'm going to call it content. And in here, I'm going to create a file called config.ts. And I'm just going to go over to my second monitor and copy this over because you don't want to watch me type all of this out. And so this is a schema for what we want our blog content to look like. So we have a name, what the blog's article's name is. We have a date, we could say that's the date it's posted, and then a description of what it is. So maybe we'll show that on the page that lists all the blog articles, and it'll also act as a meta description on our blog posts. So what we're doing here is we're importing this define collection and Z stands for Zod. It's the schema mechanic, if you will, that Astro uses. And what we do here is we give it a type of content. We create this define collection object. We give it a type of content, and we give it a schema. And then we do z.object, and then name is going to be of type string, date will be of type date, and description will again be a string. And then we have to export a collections object here. So our collection is going to be called posts, but say you had multiple articles or multiple content types, you might want to create another collection and put it in here. So now that we have that, I'm going to go create a new folder with the name of our collection and call it posts. And in here, I'm going to create a markdown file called first post, and we'll call it .markdown. And in here, similar to what we did with our Astro pages and components, we're going to give it these 3 hyphens, and in here we're going to be able to pass it those different fields that we defined over here. So we need to give it a name, a date, a description, and it's not showing it here, but we need to give it a slug as well. So that's the URL endpoint that it's going to be on after/blog. So what we'll do here is I'm going to give it a name, and I'll give it a string, and I'm going to call it first post. And then below that, I'll do a date, and I'll do 2024 08 06, for example. And then I'll do description, and I'll say, welcome to my first blog post. And then, as I said before, we have to give it a slug. So our slug will be, I'll call it first post. So on our URL endpoint, it'll look something like this. Okay, so now that we have our config, we have our metadata for our first post, what we need to do is we need to create an object for our post schema. So what we're going to do to create this is we're just going to go on our terminal, and we're going to run npx astro sync. And what that did is this generated us a object so that we have something for our post type. So I'm just going to close off some of these other files. We have way too many files open. So what we need right now is this. So this is our blog index page, and I'm going to go in here, just get this open, and we're going to go up here, and we're going to use const. I'm going to declare a variable, a constant called posts, and I'm going to do await get collection, and we're looking for posts. As you see, it's my IDE is helping me out here because it knows of this type since we use that command. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to create a div, and in here I'm going to do posts. This is in Astro files. You will use templating the same way you would in React, for example, just with the curly braces. And I'm going to call it item, and in here I'm going to create an A tag, and I'm going to then do item.data. You see my ID is stepping in again, helping me out, and then I'm going to use name. So we're going to have this link with that name in it, but we're gonna add a little bit more to it. So we'll do let's do an h2 tag. We'll put the title in an h2. H2. Whoops. And I'm just gonna give it a Tailwind class of text XL. We'll do 2XL to make it even bigger. And then below that, I'm gonna do a p tag. And in this, I'm going to do item.data.description. So we have that shown. And in this A tag, I'm just going to give it a border, round it, and give it a padding of 2 rem. And then lastly, all we got to do is when we template our href, I'm going to do item, and you will see that we have slug. It's very helpful. So now we have this content in our index.astro. That's going to be on our /blog root. So let me go back to our development server and open this, and I'm going to go to blog. So you'll see here, I can click this, and you're going to see it redirects me to first post. And then we get our 404 because the page doesn't exist. Firstly, I made a bit of a mistake here. I need to use a template string here because we need it to go to /blog/ the slug of the post. So I'm going to do this here, and then I'm going to do /blog/ that. And now, let's just go back and ensure this works. So I can click here, and yep, first post, all looks good. What we'll do now is I'm going to go into our blog folder within our pages, and I'm going to go new file, and we're going to create a dynamic root. And how you do that is you use square brackets and you give it a parameter name, and mine is .astro. And now what we're going to do is we're going to use our usual 3 hyphens, and then we're once again going to import get collection, and then below that we are going to, similar to Next.js, we're going to use a function called, it's going to be an asynchronous function, and we're going to call it get static paths. Whoops, I don't want my IDE coming in like that. And then what we're going to do in here is we use get static paths because Astro looks for that function to create static roots. So we're going to do something very similar to what we did in our index.astro inside of this function. Keep in mind it has to be inside of this function. So we're going to do await, and we're going to do get collection. And you guessed it, posts. So we're importing that, and then we're going to return a post object for each. So here, I'll call it item again, and then what we're going to do is we're going to return a object within this map function. So we're returning an array of objects, and we're going to give it a params, and all we're concerned with here is slug. So we need to pass this param because if you see here, we have in our dynamic root name, we have slug, and since we have it slug, we need to name our parameter slug. So what we're going to do is we're going to then get the item.slug. We're going to return that, and then we're going to return some props. So, and the props is just going to be the item itself so that we can see every field on the item. Then we'll go below that, and we're going to go const, and we're going to use post, and we're going to pass this as a prop. This is how you pass props in Astro. Use astro.props, and you define it as a constant object right there. So we'll do that, and then we're going to use const and content. And what we're going to do is we're going to do await post.render is the function that we're going to be using. I missed a semicolon or something around here. Or not a semicolon, it's because I gotta call it item, because that's what I defined our prop as here. So we're defining our props, and then we gotta do item.render. So we have our post item now, and now what we can do is we can very easily create some Markdown content right below here. So I'm going to create an H1. How you create an H1 in Markdown, if you don't know, is just with one ampersand, and I'll just say first post, and then I'll create an H2 tag, and I'll say introduction, and then below that I'll just write blah 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 whatever. So now I'm going to go back to our dynamic route for our blog post, and I'm going to go down here and I'm going to use our layout that we created earlier again, and in here, just to render this content, because we're using this item.render, this converts all the Markdown into HTML. So I can just use content as a component, just like that. Save that. Now we're going back to our blog. We're here on our blog. You can see I can click this first post. I'm going to click that, and then because of Tailwind, we're not seeing any styling, but you can see that in the inspection tool right here, we have our H1 of first post, our H2 of introduction, and our P tag of blah, 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 whatever. So that's the basics of how you create a blog. If you want to incorporate things like images, you can just put them in your public directory, and you pass a string. You could put this in your config here, and you could have an image, for example, and then do z.string. I'm not going to go over that because you can figure that out. I'm just more going over the basics of how you can get started. And you might also be thinking about how you can style it. There's many ways you can style it. It's kind of up to you. I typically use Tailwind typography. I find that's the easiest to use for me, and especially because I'm a Tailwind guy, but I'll leave a link in the description for some different options of how you can style your Markdown content. Okay, so one thing that we can do with Astro is we can use their built-in image component. So you'll notice I created this assets folder, and I put a little JPEG of some dogs in here. What we can do is, instead of having to use something like TinyPNG or Squoosh, we can have Astro compress the image down as small as possible, as well as lazy load the images by default in our browser, as well as also enforcing that we're using our proper alt tags. So things like that are important for your SEO. What we can do here is, since we have it in this assets folder, it has to be called assets, we can go into our Astro component and we can do import, and I'm going to call it dog image, and I'm going to do import from, and then I'll do I'll do a relative import from the assets folder, and then I'll import dogs.jpg. And then down here we can use the built-in image component. You'll see it's imported from Astro assets, and what we can do is give it a source, and we can do dog image, and then we have to give it an alt. So I'll say cute dogs. Whoops, I just gotta close this image tag, save that, and now I'm gonna go back to our browser and you'll see this image here. However, what you're gonna notice is this image, there's a little built-in auditor within Astro. It's gonna say unoptimized loading. It's because we're not eagerly loading it, but that's fine. What we need to do is give it a width and a height. So I'm just going to give it a width and a height of 500 by 400, something like that. And this right now is condensing the image, making it a lot smaller, or not condensing, compressing, I should say. And this will make it load as fast as possible. That is very helpful, but one of the downsides of it is, since you're using a lot of your own frameworks within Astro, you can't use that if you're building a React component and you want to load an image in the React component. You're going to have to compress the image yourself and put it in the public directory, because React won't be able to see it in the assets folder. Okay, so let's just do a brief summary of everything that we talked about. So in order to create pages in Astro, you go into your pages directory within your source folder, and You then use index.astro to create one in the current directory, or in the case of our blog, so you have a blog folder within Pages, we use index.astro to create one right there. Within the base of your Pages directory, you can create a 404 for a global 404 page that will show whenever your site 404s, as well as you can create dynamic routes, or if you wanted to create, say, for example, a page that's called test, I might go in here and do test.astro, for example, to create that page. To create a layout, so something that can wrap your page, for example, and you can keep it nicely organized like we have here, so that I'm not writing out all those meta tags and for the favicon and all that stuff. We don't need to worry about that. We can put that in our layout, and we do that within our layout folder right here. And we created this basic layout, and to give it to children, you create a slot. For styling, you can use CSS SASS or SCSS. I always struggle saying that, but you can use any of those as long as you import the npm module for SASS. It's the same for both SCSS and SASS. You just do npm SASS to import that. For your components, you can really create them anywhere you want, but I usually just create a components folder, and we created this little React component that's a counter that uses JavaScript. So to recall, if we go back here, in order for it to work, we need to do client load or one of the other client directives. I'll link to those different directives in the video description. For our blog, what we have to do is we have to create a folder called content and our config.ts, and here you will see this whole config, and you can create any fields you want, but just remember slug you have to define as seen here, and you don't have to put it in your config schema. So once you do that, you can then go create your index page, and you can use the get collection with a wait in order to get that collection. But remember, you have to use the npx astro sync command in order to create the type for this. Otherwise, you'll have to, if you're using Typescript, you'll have to do something like this and declare it as any. It's a bit of a pain, and it gets a little bit messy, and you can run into type errors. So just use that command once you have your schema created. After that, we can then map these posts, and we created a little a tag. But I'll pull this up again. I'll go to our blog, and we have this little link here, and we can click it, and then it takes us to this page. However, we have to create our dynamic route, and remember, we have to give it the param that has the same name as what's between these square brackets. So in this case, we're getting our slug from our mapping function of all of our posts, and I'm also passing just the post item itself as a prop. And you can see I'm defining this prop here. This is how you define props in Astro. And then we can render our content just by passing it as a component. And that will take our markdown from here, and it will, our markdown from here, I should say, and it will then render it as HTML. And then lastly, we have our image component, and this is really good because it can save you some time. But remember, just to save yourself some time, because I made this mistake when I was starting using Astro, I was trying to use this component within a React component, and it wasn't working. I couldn't figure out why. It's not going to work. That's kind of one of the downsides of Astro. So if you're using React, Svelte, Vue, something like that, pre-compress your images, using like squoosh or tinypng and put them in your public directory. That way React will be able to see them. So yeah, that's really all. That's the basics of Astro. If you're a developer, this should give you all the information that you need in order to get started building basic sites. And yeah, obviously refer to the documentation if anything was unsure. I hope all of my verbiage was correct. Sometimes I get a little bit fast and I end up messing things up. So if I messed anything up, let me know in the comments. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed.